7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So hello everyone, welcome back, and today we welcome back author and historian Damien Lewis to talk about his new book, SAS Great Escapes 3, Gripping but True Escapes, Stories Executed by World War II Heroes. Now I've got my copy here and I absolutely loved reading it. How are you doing, Damien?
Very good, and as always, great to be back. Thanks for having me on again.
No, it's complete. I'm so excited to talk about your book. And I think the first question that's going to come up. What inspired you to write this book?
The inspiration came out of other research. So it came out of research really into these three books that I've been writing about the SAS in World War II, largely based around, Colonel Blair Paddy Mayne, having had access to all the Mayne family archive. And in the process of going through all that material, reports and photographs and diaries and letters and all this kind of extremely rich, 5 years of archive from waging war behind enemy lines, there are these stories you can't tell in the main narrative because they're not particularly germane to it, but they are these incredible stories of human daring do and ingenuity and overcoming against impossible odds and the human will to survive. And so these stories in SAS Great Escapes 3 really fell out of all of that research. And, one could write SAS Great Escapes 4 without any shadow of a doubt, because the very nature of these operators and these operations, they were sent deep behind enemy lines. So small groups, four man was the minimum unit, but they were generally in very small units. And obviously massively outnumbered, and the risk of capture was very high. So a lot of them were captured. And sadly, as the war progressed, bad things happened to those who were captured. They were subject to Hitler's commando order. And by 1944, certainly they knew that. They knew that very, very likely there was going to be no mercy shown to them, and captivity spelled, a very nasty death. So the incentive to get away, to break out at the soonest possible moment, or to not get captured at all, so to be on the run and escape and evade, was massive. And so it's the nature of the unit that there are, just a plethora of incredible escape stories to choose from.
And the human nature and desire to survive really shines through in each of these stories that you've written in this book. But I think just for a little bit of context, could you let us know, what is the SAS and why were they so important in World War II?
So the SAS is the Special Air Service. It was the Special Forces unit set up at Winston Churchill's behest to wage war in a way that we had never really done before, which was deep behind enemy lines to cause havoc and chaos where the enemy least expected it, to hit their supply lines, to hit their airfields and their air bases, and very importantly, to hit the enemy's morale. Because if you knew or you feared that you were not safe, wherever it might be, however far behind the lines you were, these raiders might appear from the night looking distinctly piratical and cause havoc and mayhem. That struck the fear of God into the enemy. So this was the concept behind Special Forces operations, and the SAS were the pioneers of it. They were not particularly popular with many in high command because they were, as I say, they were piratical, and they waged war in a way which was most ungentlemanly. And to many in British high command, brought up on the First World War, it wasn't the way that British officers were supposed to behave. But as Churchill averred, and the founders of the SAS were determined to prove, doing the unexpected, attacking in a way that the enemy could never conceive of, thinking outside of the box, knowing that nothing was beyond you, and to put the most extraordinary and bizarre operational ideas into practice, that was the way to get an edge in a war which, from 1940 through to 1942, even 1943, we were losing hands down. And so it took extraordinary measures, and that's what the SAS and other related special forces units specialised in.
Thank you for that context. Let us know what the SAS were and their importance to World War II. And talking about extraordinary nature and extraordinary events, the 5 stories that you brought to us in this are extraordinary and give tales that are simply unbelievable in some cases. Now, we can't possibly cover all 5 as much as I would absolutely love to. So I'd like to look at my favourite story from your book today, and that story starts in Libya. So why were the SAS in Libya, and what was their mission in this region?
So in 1940, late 1942, early 1943, General Rommel was, the German commander in North Africa, the Desert Fox, was on the run, or at least his forces were being pushed back through North Africa, and the Allies scented victory. And in late 42, of course, there were the American-British, Anglo-British, led by the American landings in Northwest Africa, Operation Torch. And so Rommel then faced the 8th Army on the Eastern Front and the Americans and British on the Western Front, and he was sandwiched in the pincer movement. And so, the writing was on the wall for the Axis forces in North Africa. And of course, North Africa was so important because that would be the springboard for operations into Europe. So Churchill and Roosevelt had vowed to Stalin, it's really important to understand this, because Stalin was demanding a second front be opened to take off pressure on the Eastern Front. He wanted a Western Front opened by the Allies. And his preference was, landings in France. But Churchill flew to Moscow and he argued very cogently, look, we are not ready to do that. It will fail. We'll be ready in 44, not in 43. But what we can do is we'll land in the soft underbelly of Europe, they called it. Didn't turn out that way at all, which was Italy. And that will be a second front, and that will, take German and Allied troops away from the Eastern Front. And so it was largely to satisfy Stalin's desire to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front that Operation Husky, the landings in Italy, were mooted. But of course, for those to be possible, you needed a springboard, and North Africa was to be the springboard. And for that to be possible, you had to vanquish all Axis German and Italian forces in North Africa. And so in 43, late 42, early 43, the SAS were going deeper and deeper and deeper behind enemy lines into territory which was more and more off the beaten track, contested, unknown to them, very difficult to navigate, unmapped, to carry out operations which were increasingly at the edge of what you could, hope to achieve. And, some of these operations, even their senior commanders were quite open about the fact that the chances of coming back again were pretty much 50-50. So this was desperate stuff, but it was to vanquish that old enemy, Rommel, which everyone, longed to do.
Talking about the importance of that region, I think really adds context to not only the SAS story, but the wider war, a general really. But then there's a character within your chapter called Lieutenant Anthony Hough. Now he seems incredibly interesting. Now, who was he? But then what were his feelings towards his mission?
So Huff was a long-standing veteran of operations in North Africa. He had fought with the 8th Army, not in the SAS, for many, many months in these incredibly die-hard, difficult, bloody battles across North Africa, lost a lot of his really close comrades, bruising confrontations. Very, very desert-wise already because of that. Had a burning hatred of the enemy because he'd seen what they'd done to not just his fellow comrades, but actually to the local Bedouin tribes as well, who he'd seen an attack on them, unprovoked attack by the enemy from the air. And so he was determined to remain in North Africa and soldier on despite all this really horrific stuff that he'd seen and witnessed and the fighting that he'd endured. He could have gone back to the UK at a certain stage, but instead he stepped forward to volunteer for the SAS because that was the way he believed he could most effectively continue the fight. But he was very well tuned into what you could achieve in the desert. I mean, he'd been on the run in the desert. He'd retreated through the desert. He'd fought through the desert. He had far more desert experience actually than many who were in the SAS at this stage. We're talking late 1942, early 1943, because there were a lot of new recruits, especially to 2 SAS, which were just being formed, but also to B Squadron. So Paddy Mayne, Lieutenant Colonel Blair Paddy Mayne was commanding A Squadron. Those were the really long-lived desert SAS veterans, but this was largely a B Squadron operation that Huff was involved in. and that was largely new recruits into an expanded SAS of 600 strong or so. And so Hough had reservations about the mission that they were sent on, because they were basically dispatched further west than the SAS had ever gone before, into territory which was really, really horrendous to navigate. I mean, rough gullies and rocky plains which were really absolutely punishing on the jeeps. And not only that, he feared, and as did many others, that the local population in that area would be hostile to the British presence. And without the locals at least being neutral and better, ideally on your side, carrying out these kind of missions deep behind enemy lines is really, really tough. In fact, there was an old adage which used to say you could only carry out this kind of hit and run guerrilla warfare if either A, it was in a completely unpopulated area, like much of the desert was, or B, if it was populated, you had to have the local population on your side. And in both those cases, this terrain they were being sent into didn't really satisfy those requirements. And so Hough was, as were many of the officers actually who were sent in on this operation, he was concerned. And they raised their concerns, and they raised them as far as with their commander, who was commander of B Squadron, was David Stirling, Colonel David Stirling, the founder of the SAS. And basically Stirling's attitude was needs must. Their mission was to hit Rommel's supply lines. So Rommel's supply lines were strung out across the desert, across North Africa, on the few supply roads, and their mission was to get really deep behind the lines and hit those supply lines time after time after time at night, which would force Rommel to use those routes during the daylight, force the traffic onto the roads during daylight, so that the RAF could then hit those convoys from the air. So that was the actual raison d'etre of the mission, and that's a sound operational plan. It wasn't that was the problem. I mean, the SAS had been doing that for months and months and months in North Africa. The problem was the distance they had to cover, the really challenging terrain, and the lack of knowledge of whether the locals are friendly or not. And actually, just to give you an indication of how extreme this mission was, they didn't actually have enough fuel on the jeeps to travel all the way there, carry out their operations, and get back. And at one stage, one of the officers, raises that query, as do the men. How are we supposed to get there and back and do what we're supposed to do without enough fuel? And the answer was you have to steal fuel from the enemy, from their fuel dump. So this was really on the cusp of what was doable and what was possible.
How important is Hough's experience for those unexperienced men on this mission? You've mentioned that he's got desert experience, he's been fighting in the region, and he's coupled with some very inexperienced men. How does that help them within this situation?
Yeah, Hough's taken 2 or 3 of his die-hard desert companions from his previous unit into the SAS with him, so they volunteered alongside him. So he's got them on his jeep patrol, but many of the men are pretty new to all of this, and so it's having those old hands, those long experienced desert soldiers, which is absolutely crucial to this kind of operation. And it's proven, because when Hough and his men carry out their ambushes against an enemy patrol, it's Hough who makes the call, rightly so, that they need to try to start their escape and evasion, because and this again points to how difficult this mission was. Shortly after ambushing that convoy and shooting the hell out of it, and it's a big convoy. There's lots of trucks and lots of jeeps and half tracks in that convoy. And shortly after shooting up the head of the convoy from their jeeps in their desert positions, the enemy give chase. Now that's something that hasn't happened that often during these kind of desert raids, and it's all part of General Rommel's appreciation. He said in his diaries, I'll paraphrase, but it's words to the effect, this unit caused me, and he was referring to the SS, caused me more harm and more damage to the morale of my troops than any other unit in the British Army of similar size. So Rommel actually, targeted the SAS. He set up a bespoke unit. It was 500 strong. It was manned by the Fallschirmjäger, the German elite paratroops, and they were set up to hunt down the SAS. And so they trained with captured SAS jeeps to work out what the SAS would be capable of in the field. And so they were out there actively hunting down SAS units. In fact, that's how David Stirling would be captured in February 1943. It would be that bespoke Hunter unit that cornered his patrol and captured them. And so Huff very quickly realizes that this patrol is coming after them. It's not sticking to the roads, which is what they normally do. It's coming into the desert, and they're giving chase. And Huff's painfully aware of their dwindling fuel supplies. So he knows he can't afford to engage in a long desert escape and evasion because they just don't have the fuel to do it. And so as they head off into the desert night, trying to outrun these trucks crammed full of enemy troops, and they stop at periodic times to actually engage the enemy, to try and with them jeep mounted machine guns to drive them off, and then restart the escape and evasion. As he's doing that, he's painfully aware of the fact that their jeeps are sipping on fumes, and so the clock is ticking. They either find somewhere to hide up before daylight, because when daylight comes they'll be finished, because the enemy can just call in aircraft and they'll find them very quickly. Or if they don't find somewhere to hide up during the hours of darkness, they're going to run out of fuel. So they're caught between a devil and the hard place. And in that situation, the one thing you absolutely need to rely on is those soldiers with experience in that theatre of operations, keeping a calm, level head, leading from the front, making those decisions, which keeps everybody else kind of on message.
And that fuel issue becomes pivotal in this escape. How does it make it difficult? You say you've already talked, they're running on fumes. Huff is trying to manage that situation, and it comes back to bite them. What happens then?
As Sod's law would have it, they are thundering along in their jeeps through what appears to be billiard table flat, featureless terrain, and of course, sunrise is not that far off. And then the first jeep starts to cough, and it's giving up the ghost because it's run out of fuel. So they have to cross-deck men onto another jeep, and still they're continuing to try and drive across the desert and find somewhere to hide, with the enemy still in hot pursuit. And the jeeps, the remaining vehicles are coughing on the last of their petrol. And just at that moment, they spy a patch of, it's like a sunken wadi with a patch of bush and vegetation, and they manage to get the last of the jeeps into that wadi, and then they take cover and prepare for a firefight, because although they've got into cover and it's not yet sunup, there is only one patch of cover in that huge expanse of desert. And so once sunrise is upon them, it's almost inconceivable the enemy won't think, okay, they've gone to ground and there's only one place they could possibly be, and it's in that wadi, in that patch of bush.
In that wadi, they're forced to kind of engage in firefight, but they're outnumbered. They've got no way of escaping here. What happens to them, and what happens to all of these men? Because there's so many things that could be running through their heads in that moment.
Yeah, so they are, they're in reasonable cover, but two problems are: one, their jeeps are out of fuel, so there is no way that they can drive out of there. And without being able to drive out of there, you're pretty much trapped. The second major problem they have, of course, is there only so much ammunition you can carry, personal ammunition that you can carry on your person. And when you're outnumbered, many to one, the enemy is obviously going to have more ammunition than you've got. And so, although fierce battle is joined and often his men are giving far better than the enemy are giving them, it's just a numbers game. Eventually, they will run out of ammunition, and eventually, at that stage, they're going to be taken captive. And the fear is that bad things happen to SAS men taken captive. And so, at one stage, and this is the measure of the man, Hoff basically says, I will distract the enemy. You, and he's talking to the rest of his men, escape and evade across the desert on foot. That's the only thing you can do. And so Hoff beetles off along the edge of the wadi, and as he's running, crouching along the edge of the wadi, he's firing deliberately the enemy to draw their fire. And that's exactly what they do. They concentrate on him, and Hoff basically fights to the last round and eventually is surrounded and captured. He doesn't know what's happened to the rest of his men. He doesn't know the fate of the rest of his men. Obviously he hopes that they've got away, and there's every indication that they have done, but Hoff himself has been surrounded, and that's it. The game's up.
And that action there of Huff going round the wadi, how indicative is that of his role in the SAS? Because it's incredibly heroic to take and draw that fire from his colleagues.
It's not the first time that Hoff has done something like this. If you study Hoff's prior SAS war experience, this was a man of immense bravery, huge courage, but also very, very strong moral standing. He's an individual who would do what was right. He would lead from the front as an officer, never expect his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and he'd put his life on the line to save theirs, which is exactly what he does in the Wadi. So he's the epitome of what you would want an SAS officer to be, or any officer in the military for that matter, in the front line fighting military. Hoff epitomizes that, and I think that's one of the reasons why his men followed him on a mission such as this without voicing the misgivings they must have felt. Well, we know they felt them because everybody knew they didn't have enough fuel. Everybody knew the chances of coming back from this mission were slim. And so to lead a small body of men, thousands of kilometers across the desert, to carry out a mission impossible when you don't think you're going to come back, and when you know bad things will happen to you if you don't come back, that takes incredible leadership, and that's what Hoff absolutely epitomized.
And knowing that bad things were going to happen to him when he was captured, it adds another layer to that sacrifice of him getting captured. So what happens to him when he becomes a prisoner of war? Does he stay in Libya, or is he taken elsewhere?
As happened with most Allied troops taken prisoner, SAS taken prisoner in North Africa. So to be fair to General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who had declared, incidentally, it's interesting, he'd declared North Africa a war without hate. And the reason he used that phrase was, he argued that because North Africa was largely unpopulated, there would be no war waged against civilians. There would be no civilian casualties, and this was a place that, opposing armies could wage war in a pretty kind of open and almost gentlemanly fashion. That was kind of the vision of that Rommel espoused, certainly in the early stage of the war in North Africa. And again, to give him credit where credit's due, as far as we know, Rommel never instituted or carried out Hitler's commando order. So in 42, Hitler had taken great umbrage at British Special Forces operations. For some bizarre reason, he took it all very personally. He threw his toys out of the pram quite spectacularly after the first, a string of British raids and behind the enemy lines missions. And he got his lawyers together and he said, draft me a basically what's a murder order. It became known, it was called the commando order, and make it legal so that we can legally keep these men alive only for as long as we need to for the SS and Gestapo to interrogate and torture them, and then they'll be murdered. And so his lawyers deliberated for a very long time trying to work out how you legalize something that's clearly illegal under all the rules of war, and eventually came up with some tautologous argument in the commando order, which basically says, any of these men or women, because of course there were SOE female agents as well, captured in uniform, out of uniform, whether resisting or surrendering, armed or unarmed, be kept alive only for as long as the SS and Gestapo have need, and then they'll be shot out of hand. And chillingly, the commando order also said there was a warning at the end, and it said any German officer who obeys this order in action will have to face a tribunal. So, in other words, be called to account. So, Rommel needs credit for, as far as we know, never having applied the commando order to those SS captured, because he had applied it, they would have been sent into Gestapo custody, tortured and interrogated, and then killed. And that didn't happen. What did happen was mostly they were loaded aboard submarines, Italian submarines mostly, taken back across the Mediterranean, and then put into prisoner of war camps in Italy. Now, of course, those weren't particularly pleasant places. The conditions were awful. The food was terrible. There were lots of suicides of Allied troops in Italian prisoner of war camps because, the treatment was so bad and the conditions were so bad. But that's far better than suffering being subjected to the commando order.
Now, I can't imagine Hitler to have ever been someone to throw his toys out of the pram. I don't think he'd ever done that. So, but how does Hoff's personality shine through then? His leadership qualities shine through when he's a prisoner of war.
Well, just going back to what you mentioned about Hitler throwing his toys out the pram, just to clarify that, I mean, I think one of the reasons he reacted so strongly and vehemently and personally against these SAS and Commando and SOE raids and operations was because, bear in mind, we did actually carry out some assassinations. We assassinated Reinhard Heydrich, remember, in Czechoslovakia, in Operation Anthropoid. So, and of course, the SOE did put together a plan to assassinate Hitler. So, I mean, it's in the National Archives. It's a brilliant read, a great plan, but it just didn't get the backing of Allied High Command. So I guess Hitler maybe felt personally under threat because he thought, gosh, they're going to come for me. And how did Hoff epitomise the kind of spirit of the SAS when he was in captivity? Well, it boils down to the fact that he never for one moment gave up the intention of escaping. And it goes back to something which is fascinating about a lot of these individuals, almost all of them, in fact, these SAS Great Escapes. Because when I started writing, these SAS escape stories, or I conceived of writing, I kind of had this idea that, why risk everything to escape? Because if you escaped and then were recaptured, even worse things happened to you. That was not a clever thing to do if you wanted a reasonably easy life. You were taking your life in your hands. If you were recaptured in Italy, for example, the chances were you would be subjected to the commando order. That is something that did happen. So you really were taking your life in your hands because in Italy, you no longer had Rommel to protect you, of course. So if you look at the driving force behind an awful lot of these escapes, and Huff's is a case in point, you might imagine it's to get back to Queen and country and serve, but actually the real driving force behind the desire to escape was guilt. And it was the guilt to not be there with your brothers in arms in the SAS, carrying out those highly risky operations deep behind enemy lines and actually having it easy in a prisoner of war camp. That's what drove an awful lot of them. And so it was the desire to rejoin your unit and start soldiering again on SAS operations deep behind the lines and help your brothers in arms carry the load. And that's what drove so many of them. That's what actually drove Huff. And it's fascinating when you study it because it goes right to the heart of the esprit de corps of this incredible unit. That ethos that David Stirling and then Colonel Blair Paddy Mayne and others had developed, whereby you were basically a band of equals. You were on first name terms with your officers. Discipline was self-discipline. It was self-discipline because the thing everybody feared more than anything else was to be returned to unit, RTU'd. That's what would happen if you stepped out of line, you'd be returned to unit. Everybody was aghast that might happen to them because then they would be expelled from this exalted brotherhood. And so that, and then of course the idea that every individual mattered and every individual was an individual and every individual should be listened to and every idea, no matter how mad it might at first seem, was worth considering. All these things made the individual members of the unit feel valued, feel empowered, feel that they were capable. And of course, it meant that when they were captured, it made them feel that they were capable and duty bound to escape and that they had it in them to do that, even if they had to do so alone. So that's one of the really standout achievements of those who founded the SAS and built this new ethos and this new way of soldiering, was that they crafted together this incredible esprit de corps, which meant that when men like Huff were incarcerated in a prison camp in Italy, the first thing on their mind was, how do I get out of here? How do I get back to my unit and continue the good fight?
Totally agree. You can see that spirit, that ethos across all of these stories. And it is remarkable to see that thread throughout. But then how does Huff use this ethos, use this mentality that's been instilled by the SAS and the skills that he's developed across the war in the SAS to escape?
Well, his escape is it's epic in terms of both its ingenuity, but also how can I put it? stupidity and misguidedness of some in high command. So what basically happens is this: Huff and his fellows in the prisoner of war camp start digging a tunnel. Great idea, and they're dumping the tunnel excavation diggings into a sewer, and they're making great progress. And of course, at some stage, the Italians, very early on, actually, in after Operation Husky, the Italian government signs an armistice with the Allies, and the Italians are then on our side. Now, the tunnel's not quite finished at that stage, and Huff basically, and in fact, all the officers of the camp are then told about the stay put order. Now, this is going to sound extraordinary, but it's absolutely true. When the Italians signed the armistice, and bear in mind there are 80,000 odd Allied prisoners of war in prisoner of war camps all across Italy. There's a lot of them. And actually Churchill, who was himself held as a prisoner of war by the Boers in the Boer War, had said to Roosevelt and vowed to his senior commanders, we will do everything in our power to get these Allied prisoners back to Allied lines so that they're not sent to Germany. It's duty bound. It's our responsibility, our moral responsibility to do that. But Hough and the other officers are gathered together, and the senior commander of the camp says, I have received the stay put order. I'm paraphrasing, and no one is allowed to leave the camp. We will stay here until the Allies arrive and they will liberate us. Now, this was insanity. And the majority of those in the camp knew it was insanity. Hough certainly knew it was insanity, complete insanity, because the Allies were hundreds of kilometers away. The presumption that Nazi Germany would just give up Italy and let the Allies take it was pie in the sky. And so Hough and many like him were determined to resist that order, but they were warned. If you try to escape and you're captured, you'll be court-martialed. So those individuals, those Allied prisoners of war who wanted to escape from prisoner of war camps because they knew the Germans were going to be there soon, and then it would be a very different kettle of fish, they were basically threatened with court-martial. So at that stage, Hough thought, well, tunnel's not finished. And by now the Germans have arrived, by the way. They're in the town. They're all around. They know that they're coming. It's only a matter of time. So Huff decides that they're going to have to hide. And they're going to have to hide and wait for the Germans to clear the camp, at which stage they can then slip away unseen. So that's his, hide to escape a court-martial from your own senior officers, and hide to escape the Germans taking you captive. And sorry, just to finish off on the stay put order, because it just seems so extraordinary. It needs explaining, I guess. It needs some context. It was put together by MI9, which was the British Escape and Evasion specialist, and it was put together with the idea being that if 80,000 Allied prisoners of war all tried to escape at the same time and move across Italy, there would be such a need for food and provisions and all that kind of stuff that it would be kind of impossible to manage and organise for the Allies, certainly. And it was put together in the presumption that the Allied advance, having taken Sicily really quite quickly, far more quickly than we had ever envisaged, the Allied advance across Italy, north through mainland Italy, would be swift and sure. But of course, that was a complete miscalculation, because yes, the Italians had signed the armistice and joined the Allied side, but Hitler vowed immediately, Italy will not fall, and he sent General Kesselring, one of his best and most respected generals, there to defend Italy and some of his best troops. And those people like Hough and others like them, they knew instinctively that this was coming. And so they knew that if they adhered to the stay put order, that they were going to end up being put on board trains and shipped to Nazi Germany.
Thank you for that context, because even when I was reading, I was, what are they doing? Like, why on earth has that order been issued? And Huff's intelligence to realise what was going to happen with that order is extraordinary as well.
Absolutely, it's you need to have spent months, ideally years, fighting the German enemy to know in your bones instinctively that they're not going to give up, and they're not going to give Italy to the Allies, that they will fight for every inch of territory to the bitter end. Now, individuals like Hough knew that because they'd been on the front line fighting them for so long. They'd seen that in action. it's unfortunate that those individuals who put together the stay put order doubtless didn't have that kind of frontline combat experience, because I think if they had done, they would have realised that the very concept that Nazi Germany would just allow the whole of Italy to fall to the Allies was pie in the sky. And so that's why the stay put order was so misguided.
How does Huff simply just, with his accomplices, with his colleagues, how does he simply slip away when there's Germans so close to the camp?
Huff and a few comrades managed to hide in a structure in the camp, and so the Germans empty the camp, not knowing they're there. So they keep very quiet and very still, and they're not seen for, it's about 72 hours that the camp that takes to be cleared. But then, of course, they've got to get out of the camp, and the Germans are patrolling all around. So what they do is they manage to slip away to a local resistance safe house, which they know is very near to the camp. They've got that intelligence already. That was one of the places they were intending to get to, of course. Had they managed to escape by their original means, they would have gone to that safe house straight away. Now, how could there be a safe house in Italy when Italy was allied to Nazi Germany until very recently? Well, this is, I think, one thing we know very little about in terms of Italy in the Second World War. We kind of tend to think of it as a monolithic construct. Italy was fascist, it was allied with Nazi Germany. Well, it was, but that doesn't mean all the Italian people were fascist and allied to Nazi Germany. In fact, a very significant proportion of the Italian people were quite the reverse. And so Italian resistance and the partisans were operational long before the Italians capitulated in the armistice. And so the people that Hoff and his comrades link up with right away, as soon as they're out of the camp, getting into that safe house, are the Italian partisans. And very quickly, the partisans say, the only way that you can hope to get back to Allied lines is to get into the mountains, because that's the heart of the Italian resistance. And from there, we can hope to filter you back to the nearest British lines.
And thank you for correcting that misconception that we have about Italian resistance, and then looking at Italy as a monolith. But this Italian resistance, were they as disjointed as the Maquis in France, or were they slightly more unified in their resistance?
No, they were equally schismatic, you might call it, fragmented. There were communists, there were everything through to right-wing groups as well, and everything in between. So, and actually, it was a very disparate gathering, because of course you had lots of Italians, but you also had escaped Russians. So Russians who'd been soldiering with the Red Army, captured by the Germans, brought to Italy either to fight in the German army, as basically we're going to kill you, or you join the German army, or they were brought to Italy as forced labour. And a lot of them had escaped, so they came to join the partisans as well. You even had German deserters who joined the Italian partisans. So it was a very, very disparate gathering. But certainly in the north of Italy, in the mountainous north of Italy, it was very, very effective. I mean, I've written about previous operations, for example, in SAS Italian Job, where the actions of the partisans had really, really significant impacts in terms of their the breakthrough of the Gothic line, for example. And just to give you an indication of how effective they were following the Allied invasion of Italy right the way through to, kind of early 1945 even, Kesselring, Field Marshal Kesselring, gave an order. It was passed down from Hitler, but it was Kesselring who issued it in Italy, which basically said that for every German soldier killed by Italian partisans, we will kill at least 10 Italians. And so there were really horrific reprisals across the country in many, many locations where we're taking that order far beyond what it ever intended. German troops, the SS Gestapo, went into Italian villages and killed, every man, woman, and child. Even the priests were killed. That happened, really quite often. So the Italian partisans were very effective, and 26,000 German troops were allegedly, according to Kesselring, taken out by Italian partisan operations, during that stage of the war. So, they were very useful in terms of making, particularly the rural parts of Italy, no-go areas for German troops, and that was a very, very useful thing for the Allies.
And you mentioned Kesselring's order there about the reprisals to Italian people. Huff and one of his comrades, Gunn, witness some of these reprisals? How does that affect them?
Yeah, so Huff and Gunn are taken into the hills by the Italian resistance, and then they're sheltered there as the Allied front line is kind of drawing ever closer. So the idea initially is that they will wait, sheltered by these Italian families, very brave Italian families in this village in the mountains, for the Allied line to approach them. But as the Allied line draws nearer, more and more German troops are forced into this village and forced into this area. And Hoff and Gunn eventually have to go and hide in caves in the mountains, as do many of the villagers. And it's in that context that they see some of these awful reprisals happening against Italian villagers. These are people, these are individuals the German military accuse of harboring partisans or being in league with the partisans, but mostly they're just Italian villagers trying to get away from the German troops that have invaded their village and get into the mountains to be safer there. So it's incredibly moving to read those accounts, and in particular, Gunn, who's Huff's fellow escapee from the camp, and they stick together pretty much until Huff's final escape. Gunn in particular is, so moved by what he sees in terms of the horrors happening to local Italian civilians that he bonds very closely with this one Italian family. And when it comes to the moment where Hoff basically says, we need to make a break for it now, otherwise we are going to be captured. We have to go. And it's the middle of winter, by the way, and they have to, before them lies crossing over some very high peaks of the Apennine Mountains, which are snowbound and at some stages in almost blizzard-like conditions. But Huff says we have to go now, and it's Gunn who basically joins him on that initial stage of their escape and evasion, and basically then after the first day climbing the mountain says, "I just need to go back to the village just to say goodbye to some of those Italians who did so much to save us." And Huff basically knows in his heart he's never coming back. He knows instinctively that Gunn has felt his, loyalties to those Italians who did so much for them was greater than his loyalty perhaps to Huff himself. So Huff knows he's on his own, and that's, I guess, one of the toughest moments for Huff in his escape is that he's then, his brother that he's escaped from the prison of war camp and evaded all through the mountains is now no longer with him, and he's facing this horrendous climb through these snowbound mountains in terrible weather with no equipment to do so, very little food, and then crossing the German and Allied lines before him. That is a really, really tough moment.
It's very emotional and raw reading that, because you really feel for both of them for that in that moment.
But then Huff seems to be incredibly lucky in this escape. So how does luck play a role in Huff's journey back to the Allied lines?
Yeah, I mean, that there are half a dozen, maybe more times when Huff, you could argue, should have got caught. At one stage he's so exhausted he falls asleep on a muddy hillside, and there are German patrols moving all around. I mean, how he doesn't get seen and captured is really hard to comprehend. But somehow he gets through. I think the conditions were so appalling, so cold, so frozen mud, sleet and freezing rain and blizzards blowing. I think nobody really wanted to tarry in the outside, German troops included, and so no one was really that keen to investigate. But in again, one of the worst moments of his escape, he reaches what he now understands to be the front line. Of course, you can hear the fighting going on, and it's clear that there are German positions beyond them, must be the Allies, and the only way you can see possibly to get through is to slip into a river and basically crawl and swim through the river to see if that's a route that can get him through the German frontline positions to the Allied side. And you can imagine, in the middle of winter, December, January 1943-44, high in the mountains, in freezing conditions anyway, soaked to the skin, malnourished, been on the move for days and days and days, exhausted, and suddenly you have to make your progress hundreds of yards through this icebound river. Just horrific. And how he manages to do that and get through, because the German guns are ranged on either side of that river on the higher ground. How he manages to get through without being seen is hard to comprehend. I guess it's just that no one in their wildest dreams would have imagined that any human being would be in the river at that stage, because why would anybody be? And perhaps that's what means he gets through okay.
I think the sheer mental strength and fortitude and resilience to do that is perhaps due to that SAS mentality, that SAS strength that he has. Now, when he's crossed that river, he's crossed those lines. What happens when he's finally with the Allies?
Yeah, he basically pretty much crawling now. You can imagine, shivering uncontrollably. So many times he thinks he's basically done for, and then he stumbles into the first, obviously Allied soldier who's got his gun at the ready, and because he doesn't know who Huff is, obviously. And what transpires is, when Huff has made clear to the Allied soldier who he is and where he's come from, the Allied soldier and his mates basically say, "You're a very lucky man to be alive, because you've just walked through a minefield." And so the final leg of Huff's escape, once he got out of the river, he'd somehow managed to make his way through a minefield and not get blown up. And he's then taken into the nearest officer's hut or tent and given a cup of tea in great British tradition. And basically Huff knows he's made it against all odds. And actually, even at that moment when he knows, against every possible chance that went against him, he's made it through. But even at that moment, he looks back at the mountains and he wonders what's happened to his friend Gunn and whether he's actually, going to make it through himself and survive.
I think that moment there with the cup of tea at the end of it kind of encapsulates the SAS and encapsulates the British military. And it is just a nice moment for everything that Huff's gone through.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's cup of tea, lots of sugar, a lot of milk. What more could a man want? Maybe a dash of whiskey in it if there's one going. But yeah, I mean, you can imagine how he was feeling at that moment, because you're absolutely right. At so many times particularly during his time in the there are lots of moments, of course, back in with the Italian villages where there are patrols and they're hunted, and there are search parties, and there are lots of narrow shaves and escapes even back there. But that endurance and that survival through the mountains and those terrible conditions, it beggars belief. And so, to actually sit there with that cup of tea, knowing you'd made it, must have been one hell of a moment for the man. But even then, he's then got to go. He's obviously then got to recover. He needs to recuperate and all those things. But at the forefront of his mind, of course, is, when can I rejoin my unit, and where are they soldiering now, and how can I get back into their ranks and carry on doing what I was doing before? That's the important thing. That's the really important thing to stress. How many times is it the same that you read about these incredible escape stories and you think, my gosh, at the end of that, you'd need 6 months or a year's holiday. No, the first thing on their mind is, get me back to my fellow SAS operators and let me rejoin the fight.
And I think that's testament to the spirit that the SAS had built. Now, I have a final fun question for you, Damien. As we do for all guests here, you've already had one, so this is another brand new one for you. Your book, The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, has now been made into a movie. Now, what was that experience like for you as an author?
Yeah, so The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, which is really the story of Anders Lassen, VC, who was the Danish SAS and then SBS, well, first Special Operations Executive, SOE, Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, then SAS and then SBS commander throughout the war, the only member of the British SAS to have won the Victoria Cross ever, and a absolute standout figure in the war. There are 3 statues at Hereford. There's one of David Stirling, the founder of the SAS. There's one of Paddy Mayne, Colonel Paddy Mayne, who went on to command the SAS for most of the war. And the third of is Anders Lassen, VC, because he was such an iconic figure. So The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, the book, is really the story of Anders Lassen and his band of warriors throughout the war. And the movie's been made on the first fifth of the book, really, which is Operation Postmaster, which is a mission carried out by the SOE right early on in the war, one of the first deniable black operations ever carried out, a mission of incredible odds and the stakes were just so unbelievably high that the fact Churchill backed it and got it through is just, beggars belief. And what was it like having it made into a movie? Well, it was a hell of an experience. So, I remember very well going up to HMS Belfast, in London, where they were filming some of the ship scenes, because Postmaster is it's a raid on enemy shipping in a neutral harbour. So a lot of it's actually filmed aboard, a small converted Brixton fishing trawler and other warships. So I was invited to HMS Belfast where they were filming, and there's Henry Cavill and Alan Ritchson, who plays Reacher in the Amazon series, and various other extremely famous movie stars, and they're all, Henry Cavill, what a gentleman, shakes my hand. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to make your book into a movie, and I hope we've done it justice. I mean, that's pretty much what he said to me. And then Alan Ritchson, who's 6'4" and I'm 5'6", so he's twice as big as me, and I remember looking up at him saying, how's it been playing Anders Lassen, with, trying to master a Danish accent, and he basically said words to the effect, I think I've murdered it. But he said, I tell you what, he said, I cannot wait to make a sequel to this movie and play the scene where Anders Lassen, because Alan Ritchson plays Anders Lassen, goes on into Heraklion Air Base in Crete and carries out that most extraordinary raid. And this was a raid where Lassen basically leads one man. Well, there's four of them, but he's teamed up with one man called Jones. And they go onto this airbase. It was an absolutely vital raid. It was a raid to destroy German warplanes, so one of the relief convoys to Malta could get through. And Lassen goes onto the airbase. They cause havoc and mayhem, blow up all these warplanes. They leave as the enemy are searching for the raiders. And then Lassen sees some more warplanes that they've missed. Oh, we're going back in. So they go back in for a second time. This time Lassen's yelling out orders in German, because he was a fluent German speaker, to confuse the enemy. So the enemy think he's a German officer. Meanwhile, he's blowing up their warplanes. And then they leave. And then he sees some more warplanes that they've missed. And so he says, right, we're going back. So they go back in for a third time. And Alan Ritchson says, I just cannot wait to play that Anders Lassen in that amazing raid, because there's nothing else like it. So, yeah, I was really surprised at how genuinely touched they were to have made that story into a movie, and how seriously they took it. Just to give you another example, Mr. Gonzalez, who plays the female SOE agent in the movie, I went to the New York premiere of the movie, and she was there, and I took with me a coin from the Special Forces Club in London, which has the spirit of resistance engraved on it and the SOE symbol. And I gave it to her, and I said, look, just say thank you for doing an excellent job of portraying the bravest of the brave. Let's be frank about it, because those women who went deep behind enemy lines for SOE, dressed in civilian clothes with false identities, they had nothing to defend themselves with apart from their guile, their wit, their beauty, and their intelligence. And I said, you've done a great job of portraying, your character in the movie. And she said, I studied those SOE women, really extensively before playing this part. And she said, I have so much admiration for their immense bravery and courage in the war. And, it's been a real privilege for me to portray one of them on the big screen. So, again, that was really touching. And, it's great to be with people of that stature who actually got it and understood why this was important, and understood this signal bravery of these individuals who risked so much, and some gave everything, some gave all. Most of the characters in the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare do not survive the war. So to see that they sought to portray them with spirit and with their soul, and took it that seriously, was really edifying.
And I can just see and hear how much that means to you as an author, but as a person invested in these people from World War II. And it's really lovely to hear that they took it as equally as importantly as you do. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no, it was a real relief, actually, because you don't know, and one maybe has a stereotype of what famous movie stars are like. Everybody on that cast, I can honestly say, everybody on that cast was an absolute gentleman or a fantastic lady, and they just, and I could see they had such a great time filming that movie. You watch the outtakes, they had such a great time. They almost kind of recreated that special forces, you can do anything, think the unthinkable ethos on the film set, and it really worked.
And I'm so glad that you got to experience that. I think it's a lovely memory for you. So thank you very much for sharing that with us.
No worries. Yeah, my pleasure.
Now, obviously, people listen to us talk about SAS Great Escape 3. Where can they go and grab a copy? But where can they go and interact with you and your work online, Damien?
So you can grab a copy in all good bookshops. It's available on Amazon. And my website is just my name, www.damienlewis.com. I'm on Twitter at author D Lewis, and my Facebook page is Damien Lewis Writer. So you can follow me on any of those platforms, and I am regularly putting out updates on everything I do, and including the movie, actually, because it's out in the States already. We hope the release date is going to be mid-June in the UK, and so watch that space for all those kind of updates.
And I'll make sure all of them are linked in the description below, so people can go and interact with you, get a copy. And you even took away my next question there of how can people watch the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. So thank you for answering that one as well.
No worries. My pleasure, as always.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's to the next one.
Now, thank you very much for listening to this newest episode of the History of Jackson podcast, where we spoke to Damien Lewis all about the great escape of Lieutenant Anthony Hough within his brand new book, SAS Great Escapes 3, gripping true escape stories executed by World War II heroes. Now, I'm sure you can agree Anthony's story is absolutely fascinating and inspiring and awesome. And if you want to hear more content like this, or any other content that we create here at History of Jackson, please do consider heading to the Buy Me a Coffee profile in the description below, or heading to History of Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts, where you can listen to some of the world's leading historians bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. Next week, we have another awesome episode lined up, and I know you're going to enjoy that just as much as you enjoyed this brilliant episode with Damien.